Some stories refuse to die. With a desperate, clinging force, they outlive empires, laws, and the very people who tried to bury them. In 1860, when the final slave ship crossed the Atlantic to American soil, it carried more than human cargo. It carried a secret so dangerous that powerful men would spend decades trying to erase it. Yet one man remembered everything. His name was Cudjo Lewis. For 50 years after slavery ended, he kept silent. Not from forgetting, but because some truths are too heavy to speak aloud until the right moment arrives. This is the story of the last witness, the final survivor of a crime meant to vanish into history. A crime involving wealthy merchants, corrupt officials, and a conspiracy that reached Alabama's highest levels. What Cudjo saw, what he endured, and what he finally revealed would shake the foundations of what America wished to believe about itself. But a simple, terrifying question haunted him until his final days: if he told the truth, would anyone believe him? Or worse, would they ensure he never spoke again? Under cover of darkness on a humid July night in 1860, the Cudjo slipped into Mobile Bay. Captain William Foster knew exactly what he was doing. The international slave trade had been illegal in the United States for 52 years. Any ship caught importing enslaved Africans would be seized, its cargo freed, its crew hanged. But Timothy Meagher, among Mobile, Alabama's wealthiest shipbuilders, had made a bet, a reckless, arrogant wager born from whiskey and pride. Months earlier, at a dinner party, Meagher had argued with Northern visitors about states' rights and federal overreach. The conversation grew heated as the Northerners insisted the slave trade was a barbaric relic of the past. Red-faced and furious, Meagher slammed his fist on the table. "I'll bring a shipload of Africans right into Mobile Bay," he declared. "And not a single federal marshal will touch me. I'll prove Southern power is absolute, that your federal laws are nothing but paper and empty threats." The room fell silent. Some guests laughed nervously, assuming it was the bourbon talking. But Timothy Meagher never made idle threats. He was a man who built his fortune through calculated risks and an unshakable belief in his own invincibility. His brother James leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "How much would such a venture cost?" he asked quietly. Within a week, the conspiracy was formed. Timothy and James Meagher, along with Burns Meagher and several other wealthy planters, pooled $35,000, an enormous sum in 1860. They hired Captain William Foster, a skilled sailor known for discretion and a willingness to bend the law for the right price. The Cudjo was prepared, its hold modified for human cargo, its papers falsified to show a legitimate Caribbean trading mission. Foster sailed from Mobile in March 1860, crossing the Atlantic with a crew of 12 men selected for loyalty and silence. The journey to West Africa took 6 weeks. Arriving at the port of Whydah in the Kingdom of Dahomey, Foster contacted local slave traders serving King Leal. Dahomey was a powerful West African state, its power maintained through constant warfare. Prisoners of war were its most valuable export. The king's warriors were legendary for brutality and efficiency. Foster cared nothing for politics or history. He cared only about filling his ship's hold and returning to Mobile before federal authorities caught wind. 110 people were purchased for $9,000 in gold. They came from various ethnic groups, Yoruba, Fon, and others, captured during raids throughout the region. Among them was a young man named Oluwale Kosala, barely 19, who would later be called Cudjo Lewis. Cudjo's village of Bont had been prosperous and peaceful. His father was a respected community member, settling disputes and advising on farming and family. Cudjo was training to follow in his footsteps, learning the traditions and responsibilities that would one day be his. He had sisters, brothers, aunts, and uncles, a network of family stretching through the village like roots in soil. The morning of the raid, Cudjo had been working in the fields with his father and older brother. They heard drums first, not the familiar rhythms of celebration, but urgent, frantic beats meaning danger. By the time they reached the village, smoke already rose from burning homes. The Dahamean warriors had struck at dawn, when defenses were weakest. Cudjo's father pushed him toward the forest, shouting for him to run, hide, survive. But Cudjo hesitated, looking back for his mother and sisters. That hesitation cost him everything. A warrior grabbed him, struck his head with the flat of a machete, and he fell into darkness. Waking, he was chained by the neck to a line of captives. His head throbbed, blood dried on his face. He called for his family, but no one answered. The The warriors marched them for 6 days, stopping briefly for water and handfuls of food. Those who couldn't keep pace were beaten, those who collapsed were left to die. At the coast, Cudjo saw the ocean for the first time, an endless expanse swallowing the sky. Anchored in the harbor was the Clotilda, a ship that would carry him from everything he had ever known. The Middle Passage took 45 days. 110 people were packed into a hold designed for cargo, not humans. Chained in rows, unable to stand, barely able to move, the air thick with sweat, vomit, and waste. Disease spread quickly in the cramped filth. Several died during the voyage, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony. Cudjo would never speak in detail about those weeks. Asked later in life, he would shake his head, "It was a terrible time. I do not like to remember." But the scars on his wrists and ankles told part of the story, the nightmares that woke him screaming for decades told another. Some experiences are too traumatic for words, too painful to revisit even in memory. When the Clotilda reached American waters in early July 1860, Captain Foster faced a critical problem. Federal authorities in Mobile had heard rumors of Timothy Meare's boast. Revenue cutters patrolled the bay, customs officials were alert. Foster couldn't simply sail into port. He anchored the Clotilda in a remote section of Mobile Bay. Under darkness, he transferred the captives to a riverboat owned by Burns Meare. The operation took hours. Terrified, confused people moved between vessels while armed men shouted orders in a language they didn't understand. Once the transfer was complete, Foster made a decision that would hide his crime for more than a century and a half. He ordered the Clotilda stripped of anything valuable, then set afire. As flames consumed the ship, Foster and his crew watched from the riverboat. Once the fire had done its work, they towed the burning hulk into a remote bayou and let it sink into dark water. The physical evidence vanished beneath the surface, leaving only human witnesses who spoke no English and had no legal standing. The captives were taken upriver to a swampy, isolated area north of Mobile. Hidden in dense cane brakes and cypress swamps, they were kept in makeshift camps while the Meare brothers decided how to distribute their illegal property. For weeks, the Africans lived in terrified confusion. They didn't know where they were, what was happening, and had no way to communicate with their captors beyond gestures and desperate pantomime. Timothy Meare visited several times, walking among them like livestock, pointing at individuals, making notes in a ledger, dividing them among family and associates. Cudjo and about 30 others were assigned to the Meare plantation. They were given new names, simple names white overseers could pronounce. Oluwale Kosala became Cudjo, a name that meant nothing, carrying none of the history and identity of his real name. The Africans were issued rough clothing, shown to crude cabins, and put to work. But unlike enslaved people born in America, conditioned from birth to accept bondage, the Clotilda survivors remembered freedom. They remembered real names, languages, families, villages. They had been whole people with complete lives, memories that made them dangerous. The Meare brothers understood this. They kept the new arrivals separated from other enslaved workers. They instructed overseers to punish any attempts at teaching the Africans English beyond the bare minimum for work. They spread rumors through Mobile that these were enslaved people purchased legally from Georgia and South Carolina plantations. And they waited, for the scandal to fade, for questions to stop, for federal authorities to give up. The Meares were confident their wealth and political connections would protect them. They were pillars of Mobile society, respected businessmen, community leaders. Who would believe illiterate Africans over them? But history, as it often does, had other plans. Within a year of the Clotilda's arrival, America's political situation exploded. South Carolina seceded in December 1860. By February 1861, 6 more southern states followed, including Alabama. The Confederate States of America formed, and by April, the nation was at war. Timothy Meare threw himself into the Confederate cause with the same arrogant confidence he'd shown in making his bet. He believed the South would win quickly, that Northern industrial power was no match for Southern fighting spirit and British support. He converted his shipyards to produce vessels for the Confederate Navy, invested heavily in Confederate bonds, sent his sons to fight, certain they would return as heroes of a victorious new nation. For 4 years, the war raged. Cudjo and the other Clotilda survivors worked the Meare plantation, growing food for the Confederate war effort, maintaining the property while white men fought. They heard rumors of Union victories, of enslaved people escaping to freedom behind Northern lines, of a proclamation declaring them free. But in rural Alabama, far from battlefields, those rumors seemed like distant dreams. Then, in April 1865, everything changed. Union troops occupied Mobile. The Confederacy collapsed. Suddenly, impossibly, Cudjo Lewis and the other survivors were told they were free. But what did freedom mean for someone who spoke limited English, had no money, no land, no family in America, and was living proof of a federal crime committed by men who still held enormous power in Alabama? That question would define the rest of Cudjo's life, and the answer would be more complicated and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Freedom came to Cudjo Lewis not with celebration, but with confusion and fear. When Union soldiers arrived at the Mere plantation in April 1865, they gathered all the enslaved people and read from a document declaring them free. The words meant little to Cudjo, who still struggled with English. But the overseer's reactions, shock, anger, barely concealed rage, told him something fundamental had changed. The Union officer, a young lieutenant from Massachusetts, tried to explain their options. They could stay and work for wages, leave and seek employment elsewhere, or try to return home, though he admitted that for those born in Africa, such a journey was impossible. The officer meant well, but his words revealed a profound misunderstanding. What did wages mean to people who had never handled money? Where could they go when they knew nothing of American geography? How could they return to villages that might no longer exist, to families who might be dead or scattered? Timothy Mere, meanwhile, faced his own crisis. The Confederacy had lost. His Confederate bonds were worthless. His shipyards were damaged during Union occupation. His sons returned from war, one missing an arm, another suffering from what would later be called shell shock. The world that made him wealthy and powerful was collapsing. But Mere was a survivor. He understood the war might be over, but the struggle for power in the South was just beginning. He recognized the Clotilda survivors represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious: they were living evidence of a federal crime. If federal prosecutors decided to make an example of someone, the Clotilda case would be perfect: clear crime, undeniable evidence, the penalty execution sending a powerful message. Mere knew that in Reconstruction's chaotic early days, with federal troops occupying the South and radical Republicans pushing for harsh punishment of Confederate leaders, he was vulnerable. But Mere also saw an opportunity. The Africans needed land, a place to build their lives. Mere owned thousands of acres of worthless swamp land along the Mobile River, land too wet for farming, too remote for development, too mosquito-infested for anyone to want. If he could convince them to settle there, he could keep them close where he could monitor them, bind them through debt, and create an appearance of benevolence that might protect him from prosecution. Weeks after the war's end, Mere approached the Clotilda survivors with a proposal. He would sell them parcels, 2 acres per family, at what he claimed was a fair price. They could pay over time, working for wages on his remaining properties or in his shipyards, their earnings going toward the land debt. To people who had nothing, desperately wanting to recreate some version of the communities they'd lost, it seemed like a miracle. Cudjo was among those who accepted. He was 24, strong and healthy, determined to build a life in this strange new country. He had met a woman named Abiel, another Clotilda survivor renamed Celia by her enslavers. She was from a different village, spoke a different dialect, but they shared the bond of the Middle Passage and a desperate need to create family where they had none. They married in a ceremony blending what they remembered of African traditions with the Christian rituals they'd been forced to learn. Together, Cudjo and Abiel began to build. They cleared land, cutting through thick underbrush and draining standing water. They built a small cabin using techniques Cudjo remembered from Bont, adapted to Alabama materials. They planted a garden with vegetables and herbs, some familiar from Africa, others new. They joined other Clotilda survivors to create a community. The settlement that would become Africatown took shape slowly over several years. About 30 families clustered along the Mobile River, homes arranged in patterns echoing African village layouts. They spoke native languages, Yoruba primarily, but also Fon and others, creating a linguistic island in the American South. They practiced what they remembered of traditions, adapted what they had to, and created something new, a hybrid culture neither fully African nor fully American. But the land deal revealed itself as another form of bondage. The prices Mere charged were inflated far beyond the land's value. Interest rates were usurious. Wages he paid barely covered necessities, let alone significant debt payments. Cudjo and others found themselves trapped, working constantly, earning little, always owing more. Beneath economic exploitation lay more insidious control, fear. Timothy Meagher and his brothers began a quiet, relentless campaign to ensure the Clotilda survivors stayed silent. The message was delivered through intermediaries, overseers, foremen, white workers with connections to the Meaghers. It was never explicit, never written, but unmistakable. Speaking about the Clotilda would bring trouble. The threat took many forms. Sometimes economic. Mr. Meagher might have to call in those land debts if people start spreading stories. Sometimes legal. Federal authorities might decide to deport anyone brought here illegally. Sometimes direct. Accidents happen to people who don't know when to keep their mouth shut. Cudjo understood the game. He had seen how power worked in Dahomey, where King Glial maintained control through rewards and threats. The Meaghers used the same tactics, giving just enough land, wages, and appearance of freedom to make people hesitant to risk losing it, and creating just enough fear to keep them silent. The 1870s brought new challenges and dangers. Reconstruction was in full swing, a brief moment when real change seemed possible. Black men could vote, black politicians were elected, schools opened for black children, federal troops enforced new laws. Cudjo watched with cautious hope. He learned to read and write, attending classes taught by Northern missionaries. He registered to vote, casting his ballot for the first time. He attended political meetings where black and white Republicans discussed rebuilding the South on equality and justice. But he also saw the backlash. White supremacist groups, the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, launched campaigns of terror. They burned schools and churches, murdered black politicians and voters, attacked anyone supporting Reconstruction. The violence was systematic, organized, designed to send a clear message: black political participation would not be tolerated. In 1874, Cudjo witnessed an event that would haunt him. A black man named Samuel Johnson, elected to the Mobile City Council, was found dead on the road between Africatown and Mobile. The official story was robbery. But everyone knew the truth: Johnson had been murdered for speaking out against the Meagher's business practices, including exploiting black workers. No one was arrested. No investigation was conducted. The message was clear: even elected officials weren't safe challenging white power. Cudjo attended Johnson's funeral, standing in the back, listening to the preacher talk about martyrdom and justice. But beneath the words, Cudjo heard a warning: this could happen to anyone who speaks too loudly. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over. Federal troops withdrew. White supremacist governments reclaimed power. The brief window of black political participation slammed shut. New laws, black codes, later Jim Crow, stripped voting rights, segregated public spaces, and created legal discrimination for nearly a century. The Meagher family, far from being prosecuted, grew wealthier and more powerful. Timothy Meagher expanded into railroads, lumber mills, and real estate, becoming a respected figure, his past conveniently forgotten by white citizens benefiting from his economic influence. When he died in 1892, his obituary praised him as a pioneer businessman and pillar of the community. The Clotilda was not mentioned. Cudjo and Abiel were raising a family. Their first child, Alec, was born in 1866, James in 1868, Cudjo Jr. in 1870, Polly in 1872, David in 1875, and finally Celia in 1878, 6 children born free in America who would never know their parents' horrors but would inherit the consequences. Cudjo worked constantly, on docks loading ships, in lumber mills cutting timber, odd jobs repairing fences, building sheds. Abiel took in laundry, washed clothes for white families, sold vegetables from their garden. Together, they slowly, painfully paid down the land debt. But Cudjo also taught his children their heritage. Evenings after work, he gathered them, telling stories about Bont. He taught Yoruba words, explained traditions and values. He wanted them to know where they came from, even if he couldn't tell the full truth of how they arrived. The children grew up straddling 2 worlds. At home, African languages and stories. In the wider world, harsh realities of being black in Jim Crow Alabama. They attended segregated schools with hand-me-down textbooks and underpaid teachers. They learned racial etiquette: never look a white person directly in the eye, always step off the sidewalk when a white person approaches, never question white authority. Cudjo watched with pride and heartbreak. They were adapting, surviving. But he also saw the system crushing their spirits, limiting possibilities, teaching them to accept injustice as normal. He wondered if he made the right choice accepting Mear's deal, staying in Alabama. But where else could they have gone? Would it have been different? Then tragedy struck, again and again, until Cudjo felt punished by forces beyond understanding. In 1893, daughter Celia fell ill with fever. She was 15, bright and beautiful with her mother's smile and father's determination. Cudjo and Abiel tried everything: home remedies, prayers, a white doctor charging a week's wages for a brief examination. Nothing worked. Celia died on a hot August night, body burning with fever, parents helpless beside her. Grief nearly destroyed them. Abiel stopped speaking for weeks, moving through the house like a ghost. Cudjo threw himself into work until exhaustion made thought impossible. They buried Celia in the small Africatown cemetery, marking her grave with a wooden cross Cudjo carved himself. 3 years later, in 1896, son David was killed. Circumstances were murky, details contradictory, but the outcome brutally clear. David had argued with a white co-worker at a sawmill. It escalated. The white man struck David. David, young and angry and tired of swallowing insults, struck back. That night, David didn't come home. Cudjo searched, calling his son's name into darkness. He found David's body at dawn in a ditch beside the road, beaten to death. Cudjo carried him home, walking 3 miles with his son's weight. Neighbors wept. Everyone knew: no justice, no investigation, no consequences. Cudjo wanted to go to the sheriff, demand accountability. But Africatown elders stopped him. You go to the sheriff, they'll find reason to arrest you. They'll say David started it, attacked a white man, you're causing trouble. You'll end up dead or in prison, and Abiel will lose husband and son. So Cudjo buried David next to Celia, carved another cross, and swallowed his rage. Something broke inside him that day. He had survived the Middle Passage, slavery, 50 years of dangerous freedom. But watching his children die, unable to protect them or seek justice, that was a different kind of death. The worst blow came in 1902. Cudjo Jr., their third child and namesake, worked as a brakeman for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, coupling and uncoupling train cars, often while moving. On a cold February morning, something went wrong. Cudjo Jr. was crushed between 2 cars. The railroad claimed it was his fault, careless, violating safety procedures. They denied compensation. When Cudjo Sr. tried to pursue it, railroad lawyers threatened to sue for defamation and harassment. The message was clear: accept the loss and move on, or lose everything. Cudjo was 61. He had buried 3 of 6 children. Abiel's health was failing, spirit broken by repeated grief. Cudjo faced a question haunting him since the Clotilda landed: what was the point of survival if everything you built could be taken away? But even in darkest moments, Cudjo held on to memory. He remembered Bont, his father's teachings, the values guiding his people for generations. He realized if he died without speaking, if he let the Mears succeed in burying the truth, his children's deaths would be meaningless. The Clotilda would be forgotten, the crime erased, the next generation never knowing what had been done. So Cudjo made a decision: he would wait for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity. When it came, he would tell the truth, all of it, no matter consequences. He just had to survive long enough to find someone who would listen. Early 20th century brought change and continuity to Africatown. The community grew with children and grandchildren of survivors, a vibrant, tight-knit neighborhood with churches, mutual aid societies, and institutions serving needs in a segregated society. But they faced increasing pressure from industrial development along the Mobile River. Factories and shipyards encroached, air grew thick with smoke and chemical smells, the river, once a source of fish and fresh water, became polluted. White-owned businesses bought land around the community, squeezing it smaller. The pattern was familiar: make life difficult enough, people leave, freeing land for profitable uses. Cudjo watched with weary recognition. He was in his 60s, body worn from decades of hard labor. Abiel's health declined, suffering melancholia, severe depression from repeated trauma and loss. She spent much time sitting, staring out the window, occasionally speaking Yoruba to people not there. Cudjo cared for her but kept working. The land debt was finally paid, but they needed money for food, medicine, necessities. He took whatever jobs he could find, though employers were reluctant to hire older black workers. In 1908, Abela died. 67 years old, she spent 43 years in America without ever seeing homeland again. Cudjo buried her next to their children, carving her headstone himself in English and Yoruba, Abela Seli, wife and mother, gone home. After her death, Cudjo lived alone. Surviving children had families nearby, but he preferred solitude. He tended his garden, repaired his house, sat on his porch watching the world change. Neighbors checked on him, brought food. He was grateful but increasingly isolated, one of the last Clotilda survivors alive, the weight of memory becoming unbearable. In 1914, something unexpected happened. A young black woman named Emma Langdon Roche came to Africatown, a writer and historian documenting stories of formerly enslaved people before lost forever. She had heard Clotilda rumors and wanted to know if true. Cudjo agreed, cautiously. He told about life in Bont, the raid, Middle Passage, years of slavery, complicated decades of freedom. But when she asked specific questions about the Clotilda, who brought them, how they arrived, what happened to the ship, Cudjo became evasive. "It was a long time ago," he said. "My memory is not so good anymore." Roche was persistent. She interviewed other residents, pieced together fragments, and published historic sketches of the South in 1914, including a chapter on the Clotilda and survivors, the first time the story appeared in print, creating a small local stir. The Meir family's response was swift and coordinated. They called the book sensationalized fiction, questioned Roche's sources, pointed out inconsistencies, different people remembered different details, dates didn't always match, some elements seemed exaggerated. They suggested Roche was taken in by tall tales and folklore, confusing legend with fact. The campaign was effective. Mobile newspapers questioned the book's accuracy, historians dismissed it as unreliable. Within a few years, historic sketches of the South was largely forgotten, interesting but unverified local lore. Cudjo read about the controversy with frustration and resignation. He had told Roche the truth, or part, but held back, afraid of what might happen speaking too openly. Now the Meirs had discredited the story, making it seem fantasy rather than documented fact. The pattern was depressingly familiar: the powerful control the narrative, the powerless watch truths erased. But Cudjo noticed something interesting. Despite efforts to discredit, people kept asking questions. Journalists occasionally came looking for the old African men supposedly brought on the last slave ship. Historians wrote letters asking for interviews. Even some white mobile residents expressed curiosity. The questions made Cudjo think, maybe the time wasn't right yet, but maybe it would come. Maybe there would be someone who would listen, really listen, with skill and credibility to tell the story in a way that couldn't be dismissed. He just had to stay alive long enough to find that person. Years passed slowly. World War I came and went, barely touching Africatown except for young men who went to fight and sometimes didn't return. The 1920s brought economic prosperity to some parts of America, but not to black Southern communities. Africatown remained poor, isolated, increasingly surrounded by industrial development bringing pollution but no jobs. Cudjo was in his 80s now, moving slowly, vision failing, hearing diminished, but mind sharp, memory perfect. He still recalled every detail of Bont, still heard his father's voice, still felt chains on his wrists during the Middle Passage. Memories hadn't faded, if anything, they became more vivid as other aspects of life receded. Then, in spring 1927, a woman named Zora Neale Hurston came to Africatown. Hurston was unlike anyone Cudjo had ever met, a young black woman educated at Barnard College, studying anthropology under Franz Boas. She researched African American folklore and culture, traveling the South with notebook, camera, and insatiable curiosity. She had heard about Africatown and was determined to document Clotilda survivor stories before lost forever. When Hurston knocked, Cudjo was initially suspicious. He'd spoken to journalists and researchers before, experience was rarely positive. They wanted exotic stories about Africa, savage customs and primitive beliefs, treating him like a curiosity, not a person. But Hurston was different. "Mr. Lewis," she said, "I'm here to listen to your story. Not the story white people want to hear, but your story in your own words, told the way you want to tell it. I'm here to write it down exactly as you say it, to preserve your voice and truth. And I promise I will do everything in my power to make sure the world hears what you have to say." Cudjo looked at her a long moment, studying her face, gauging sincerity. He had been waiting for this moment over 60 years, waiting for someone to trust with the full truth. Was this young woman the one? "Come in," he said finally. "Sit down. I will tell you everything." Over several months, Hurston visited regularly. She arrived mornings, notebook in hand, sat on his porch or in his small living room. Cudjo would talk, sometimes hours, in a mixture of English and Yoruba, pausing to find words or compose himself when memories became too painful. Hurston was a skilled interviewer. She didn't interrupt, push for sensational details, or shape narrative to preconceived ideas. She listened, asked clarifying questions, wrote everything down. She also took photographs, Cudjo standing before his householding tools, tending his garden, sitting in his rocking chair on the porch. Cudjo told her everything. He described childhood in Bont in vivid detail, village layout, daily routines, ceremonies, celebrations, social structures, family relationships. He talked about his father's teachings, values guiding his people, sense of belonging and purpose defining early life. He described the raid with painful clarity, drums, smoke, screams, the moment his father pushed him toward the forest and he hesitated, the blow knocking him unconscious. He talked about waking in chains, the march to the coast, seeing the ocean for the first time, the ship carrying him from everything he knew. The middle passage was hardest to discuss. Cudjo would sometimes stop mid-sentence, face contorting with remembered pain, hands trembling. Hurston waited patiently, not pushing, letting him take time. When he continued, Cudjo spoke in short, clipped sentences describing darkness, chains, smell, sounds of people dying around him. He talked about arriving in Mobile Bay, the burning of the Clotilda, being hidden in swamps while the Mir brothers decided what to do with illegal cargo. He described years of slavery, confusion of freedom, the land deal seeming salvation but becoming another bondage. And he talked about his children, their births, lives, deaths. This was perhaps most painful, more than the middle passage, because losses still felt fresh, wounds never healed. When Cudjo spoke about burying Celia, David, and Cudjo Jr., tears ran down his weathered face, voice breaking with grief raw as the day had happened. But Cudjo also revealed something Hurston hadn't expected: he was still afraid. Even at 86, with most Mir brothers dead, slavery abolished over 60 years, he feared what would happen speaking too loudly. "They don't want us talk about the ship," Cudjo told Hurston. "They say it make trouble. They say we should forget, move on, not stir old problems. But how can I forget? How can I move on when I remember everything? When I close eyes, I see my father's face, hear mother's voice, smell smoke from burning village. How do you forget that?" Hurston asked why afraid, what specifically he thought might happen. Cudjo's answer was simple and devastating: the Mir family still own most land around here. They still have power, friends in government, ways of making life difficult for people who cause trouble. And I still live on land I bought from them. My children live here, grandchildren live here. If I speak too loud, make them angry, what happens to my family after I'm gone? It revealed fundamental nature of power and oppression. Even after slavery ended, even after legal equality supposedly established, mechanisms of control remained: economic dependence, social pressure, threat of violence. These tools were as effective as chains and whips, more insidious because harder to see and fight. But Cudjo also told Hurston, "I am old now. I have lived longer than ever thought. I have seen children and grandchildren grow. I have paid off land debt. I have built life here, though not life I would have chosen. And I want truth known before I die. I want people to understand what was done to us, not just by Mirs, but by a whole system allowing it to happen and trying to pretend it never did." Hurston promised to tell his story, make sure world knew what happened. She took photographs. In one striking image, Cudjo stands straight despite age, looking directly at the camera with expression dignified and defiant. I seem to look through lens, through time, directly at future viewers demanding to be seen and heard. Hurston also interviewed other Clotilda survivors still living: Polly Allen, Asa Kibi, a few others. Each had their story, memories, perspective. Hurston documented all, creating a comprehensive record of the Clotilda and survivors. When Hurston finished research and returned to New York, she wrote a book based on interviews with Cudjo. She titled it Barracoon, using the term for holding pens where enslaved Africans were kept before loading onto ships. The manuscript was powerful, raw, unflinching, presenting Cudjo's story in his own words, preserving voice and perspective without filtering through academic language or literary conventions. But when Hurston tried to publish, she hit a wall. Publishers in late 1920s and early 1930s weren't interested in an illegal slave trade story from an African perspective. They wanted comfortable narratives about the Old South, reconciliation, progress, how far America had come since slavery's bad old days. Cudjo's story was too raw, accusatory, uncomfortable. Some objected to preserving Cudjo's dialect rather than translating to standard English, said it made book hard to read, would limit audience. Hurston refused to change it. Preserving Cudjo's voice exactly as he spoke was essential to story integrity. Translating to standard English would erase him again, make him fit white expectations rather than presenting him as truly was. Other publishers were more direct. The Meir family was still prominent in Alabama. The story made respected Southern businessmen look like criminals, raised uncomfortable questions about how many other respected families built wealth through illegal, immoral means, challenged narrative of Southern honor and nobility promoted through books, movies, popular culture. One publisher told Hurston bluntly, "This book would cause too much trouble, offend too many people, open old wounds better left closed. Why can't you write something more uplifting, showing how far we've come rather than dwelling on past?" Hurston tried multiple publishers over years, but answer was always no. Frustrated, eventually moving to other projects, she would write Their Eyes Were Watching God and celebrated works. Hurston put the Barracoon manuscript in a drawer. It would remain unpublished nearly 90 years. Meanwhile, back in Africatown, Cudjo Lewis continued quiet life. He tended garden, repaired house, sat on porch watching world change. Neighbors visited. Cudjo told stories about Africa, old days, people who came on the Clotilda. He became a living link to rapidly disappearing past, keeper of memories no one else could preserve. But Cudjo also felt time's weight pressing down. He was in his 90s, one of Africatown's oldest people. Body failing, strength diminishing. He knew he didn't have much time left, worried about what would happen to the story after he was gone. Hurston promised to publish, but years passed, nothing appeared. Would truth die with him after all? Summer 1935, Cudjo's health declined sharply. Pneumonia, weakened body couldn't fight it. Children and grandchildren gathered around his bed, holding hands, speaking softly in English and Yoruba fragments. Cudjo drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking sometimes English, sometimes native language, sometimes mixing both. In final moments, witnesses said Cudjo spoke Yoruba, calling names no one recognized, his father, mother, siblings from Bont. He seemed to see people not there, reaching to touch faces only he could see. Then, peacefully, he died. July 17, 1935. Cudjo Lewis was 94, last survivor of the Clotilda, last person born in Africa and brought to America as a slave. With his death, a direct link to that history was severed. No one alive could ever again say, "I remember Africa. I remember the Middle Passage. I remember slavery from personal experience." Cudjo's funeral was at Union Baptist Church in Africatown. Hundreds attended, family, neighbors, people throughout Mobile who had heard of the old African man and wanted to pay respects. The preacher spoke about Cudjo's long life, strength, faith, dedication to family and community, a bridge between two worlds, a man who never forgot where he came from but built life where forced to stay. Local newspapers ran obituaries. The Mobile Register called him last survivor of the last slave ship, though brief, focusing more on age than arrival circumstances. The Birmingham News ran a longer piece calling Cudjo a living link to a bygone era, a curiosity of history. None mentioned the Clotilda by name, none identified Timothy Meir or brothers as men who brought Cudjo to America, none called what happened a crime or suggested anyone be held accountable. The story was presented as sad but distant history, interesting but not particularly relevant to present. The Meir family, by then third and fourth generations, said nothing publicly about Cudjo's death. But privately, they must have felt relief, the last witness gone, the last person who could testify to what really happened was dead. The story could finally be buried for good, fade into legend and folklore, stripped of power to accuse and demand justice. Except it couldn't. Because Cudjo had done something the Meirs hadn't anticipated, he trusted Zora Neale Hurston with the truth, and she wrote it down. The manuscript sat in a drawer, unpublished and unknown. But it existed. And as long as it existed, the story could not be completely erased. Truth, it turned out, was more patient than anyone realized. It could wait decades, generations even, for the right moment to emerge. And when that moment came, it would speak with Cudjo's voice, telling a story that refused to die. For decades after Cudjo's death, the Clotilda story existed in a strange liminal space. Known locally in Mobile and Africatown, passed down through families like a precious heirloom. Grandparents told grandchildren about the ship-bringing ancestors from Africa, about the Mir family's crime, about Cudjo Lewis and other survivors building a community from nothing. But outside Africatown, the story was treated as folklore, a legend that might or might not be true, interesting but unverified. The Mir family continued prospering through mid-20th century. Their name was on streets, buildings, businesses throughout Mobile. Mir Avenue ran through the city's heart. Mir State Park, donated by family, was a popular recreation area. Family descendants were respected community members involved in business, politics, civic organizations. The Clotilda was never mentioned in connection with their name. If anyone brought it up, they were dismissed as spreading unsubstantiated rumors. But history refuses to stay buried, especially when wounds inflicted have never healed. In the 1960s to 1970s, as the civil rights movement forced America to confront racial history, scholars took new interest in stories like Cudjo's. Researchers combed archives for evidence of the Clotilda and other aspects of the slave trade deliberately hidden or forgotten. They found shipping records from Mobile in 1860 showing unusual July activity, boats moving at night, unexplained cargo transfers, federal customs officials investigating illegal slave ship rumors. They found newspaper articles from the time briefly mentioning Timothy Mear's boast and subsequent investigation. They found court documents related to Mear's business dealings showing large unexplained early 1860 expenditures consistent with financing a slave trading voyage. Documentary evidence was fragmentary but suggestive, supporting the story passed down in Africatown, lending credibility to what had been dismissed as folklore. Historians began writing about the Clotilda, including it in books about the slave trade and Reconstruction. The story reached a wider audience, though still treated with some skepticism by mainstream historians preferring well-documented events over stories based primarily on oral tradition. In Africatown itself, the community struggled. Industrial development beginning early 20th century accelerated dramatically after World War II. Factories, chemical plants, paper mills surrounded the neighborhood, bringing pollution but few jobs for residents. Air was thick with chemical smells, Mobile River water contaminated with industrial waste. Cancer and respiratory disease rates in Africatown were significantly higher than other Mobile parts. The community also dealt with urban renewal and highway construction. In the 1960s, Interstate 165 was built, cutting through Africatown's heart, displacing dozens of families. The highway created a physical barrier isolating the neighborhood from the rest of Mobile, making it harder to access jobs, services, opportunities. The pattern was familiar: highways routed through black neighborhoods, destroying communities, depressing property values, while white neighborhoods were protected. By the 1980s to 1990s, Africatown was in serious decline. Young people left seeking opportunities elsewhere. Houses abandoned, businesses closed, infrastructure crumbled. The community Cudjo Lewis and other Clotilda survivors built with determination and hope was slowly dying, strangled by pollution, neglect, systemic discrimination. But even as the physical community declined, interest in its history grew. In 1997, the National Park Service conducted an Africatown study, documenting historical significance and recommending preservation as a cultural heritage site. The study included extensive Clotilda research, historical records, archaeological evidence, oral histories passed through families. The report confirmed what Africatown residents always knew: the Clotilda story was true. Timothy Mear and brothers illegally imported 110 enslaved Africans in 1860, burned the ship to hide evidence, escaped prosecution. Survivors were forced to settle on land sold at inflated prices by their former enslaver, creating a community both a testament to resilience and a reminder of the crime that brought them there. The National Park Service report should have been a turning point: official recognition, community receiving support and resources deserved. But while generating media attention and academic interest, it didn't lead to significant change. Africatown remained poor, polluted, neglected. The Mear family, asked about the report, declined to comment or issued vague statements about history's complexity and importance of moving forward rather than dwelling on past. Physical evidence of the Clotilda remained elusive. The ship was burned and sunk in 1860, exact location lost to time. Over decades, various people searched for the wreck. But the mobile Tensaw Delta is a vast, complex waterway with countless bayous, channels, and swamps. Finding a single sunken ship was like finding a needle in a haystack. Without the ship itself, some historians argued the Clotilda story couldn't be definitively proven. Yes, historical records suggested something happened. Yes, oral histories passed through families, but without concrete physical evidence, there was room for doubt. And as long as doubt existed, the story could be dismissed, minimized, explained away. Then, in 2018, something remarkable happened. Reporter Ben Raines, working for Alabama news website AL.com, decided to search for the Clotilda. Raines was an experienced investigative journalist and amateur marine archaeologist. Researching the Clotilda story for years, he was convinced the ship could be found with the right tools and place. Raines started studying historical records for clues where Captain Foster scuttled the ship. He found accounts from people who spoke to Foster years after the event, descriptions mentioning specific landmarks and geographical features. He studied old Delta maps, comparing to modern satellite imagery to identify areas matching historical descriptions. Using this research, Raines narrowed the search area to a mobile river section north of the city. He used sonar to scan the river bottom, looking for anomalies indicating a shipwreck. Work was slow, tedious, often frustrating. The river was murky, visibility poor, countless debris and natural features creating false positives. But in January 2018, Raines found something. Sonar showed a large object buried in mud on the river bottom in an area matching historical descriptions of where the Clotilda was scuttled. Raines contacted marine archaeologists from the University of Southern Mississippi and Alabama Historical Commission. Together, they conducted a thorough investigation. What they found was unmistakably a mid-19th century ship. Partially buried in mud, but enough visible to determine size and construction, a two-masted schooner, approximately 86 feet long, built of pine and oak, details matching historical Clotilda descriptions. The ship showed fire damage evidence, consistent with accounts it was burned before sinking. Over the next year, archaeologists carefully excavated and documented the wreck. They recovered artifacts, wood pieces, metal fittings, rope and canvas fragments. They took samples for carbon dating and wood analysis. Piece by piece, they built an identification case. In May 2019, the Alabama Historical Commission announced the wreck was the Clotilda. Physical evidence missing for 159 years was finally found. The story dismissed as folklore, questioned, doubted, minimized, was now proven beyond reasonable doubt. The discovery made international news. Major newspapers worldwide ran stories about the last slave ship and survivors. Television networks produced documentaries. Scholars researching the Clotilda found their work in the spotlight. In Africa Town, descendants felt vindication and grief, vindication because family stories proven true, grief because it took so long for the world to believe them. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions about accountability and justice. The Meir family built generational wealth on enslaved people's backs, including those illegally imported on the Clotilda. That wealth passed through generations, creating opportunities and advantages compounding over time. Meanwhile, Clotilda survivor descendants were systematically denied opportunities, subjected to discrimination, forced to live in a polluted, neglected community. The contrast was stark, undeniable: criminals' descendants wealthy and comfortable, victims' descendants struggling with poverty, environmental racism, ongoing systemic discrimination effects. And this wasn't ancient history. Many Africa Town residents in 2019 were great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren of survivors. The crime happened only 5 or 6 generations ago, well within living family memory. Activists and community leaders spoke out more forcefully about need for reparations and restorative justice. They pointed out the Meir family was never prosecuted, never paid penalty, never acknowledged wrongdoing. They argued the family had a moral obligation to make amends, to use some wealth built on slavery to help the harmed community. The Meir family's response was largely silence. A few family members expressed general sympathy for slavery's history and ongoing effects, but stopped short of accepting responsibility or offering concrete restitution. Some argued they shouldn't be held accountable for ancestors' actions over a century ago. Others refused to comment, referring questions to lawyers issuing terse, no-comment statements. The debate over accountability and reparations continued, raising fundamental questions about historical justice. How make amends for crimes committed generations ago? Who is responsible, direct descendants of criminals or society as a whole? What form should reparations take, financial compensation, land return, community development investment, or something else? How calculate value of stolen lives, stolen labor, stolen opportunities compounding across generations? These questions had no easy answers, but the Clotilda discovery made them impossible to ignore. Physical crime evidence was now visible, documented, preserved. The story could no longer be dismissed or minimized. Truth was out, demanding a response. Then in 2018, as the Clotilda search intensified, another puzzle piece fell into place. Zora Neale Hurston's manuscript Barracoon, rejected by publishers in the 1930s, sitting in archives decades, was finally published. The decision came from Hurston's estate and HarperCollins publishers, recognizing the cultural moment had finally arrived for Cudjo's story to be heard. The book, too raw, accusatory, uncomfortable in the 1930s, was exactly what 2018 readers needed. The manuscript was lightly edited for clarity, but Hurston's decision to preserve Cudjo's voice and dialect was maintained. The book presented Cudjo's story exactly as he told it, in his own words, with all power and pain intact. Barracoon, published in May 2018, almost exactly 1 year before the Clotilda was officially identified. Timing was remarkable, as if Cudjo's voice finally broke through after decades of silence. The book became a bestseller, reaching worldwide audiences. Readers who never heard of the Clotilda, knowing little about slave trade details, were confronted with Cudjo's testimony, direct, personal, impossible to dismiss. Barracoon did something powerful. It gave Cudjo a voice across time. Dead over 80 years, but suddenly people were listening. They read his descriptions of Bont, his account of the raid and Middle Passage, his careful explanations of how the Mears maintained control after slavery ended. They heard his grief over lost children, his longing for Africa, complicated feelings about America, a country that stole his life but where he built family and community. Readers were struck by Cudjo's dignity, intelligence, moral clarity. He didn't present as a victim seeking pity, but as a witness demanding truth be acknowledged. He didn't ask for revenge, but insisted on justice, not just for himself, but for all people whose stories were erased or forgotten. The book also revealed something shocking. Cudjo's story wasn't just about past, it was about present. Systems of power, exploitation, and silence allowing the Mears to commit crime and escape justice were still operating, just in different forms. Mechanisms keeping Cudjo afraid to speak for 50 years, economic dependence, social pressure, threat of violence, were still in place, keeping people silent, protecting the powerful. The combination of the Clotilda's discovery and Barracoon's publication created a cultural moment. Suddenly, the story was everywhere: newspapers, television, academic conferences, community meetings. People who never thought much about the slave trade or its legacy confronted concrete evidence of how it worked and how effects persisted. In Africatown, attention brought opportunities and challenges. Renewed interest in preserving community history and culture. The National Park Service began plans for a heritage area, foundations and nonprofits funded community development projects, tourists visited wanting to see where Clotilda survivors built lives. But attention also brought gentrification and exploitation concerns. Would renewed interest lead to investment benefiting current residents? Or drive up property values and displace people whose ancestors built the community? Would the story be told honoring survivors and descendants, or sanitized and commercialized, a tourist attraction erasing ongoing crime effects? These concerns heightened because much land around Africatown was still owned by mere family descendants or corporations with family ties. Same power and control patterns from Cudjo's time were still in place, just more subtle forms. The fight for justice wasn't just about acknowledging past, it was about changing present and future. In 2020, the Alabama Historical Commission announced plans for an Africatown Museum and Heritage Center telling the Clotilda and survivor story. The project included preserving Cudjo Lewis's house, still standing on land purchased from Timothy Mear over 150 years earlier. The house would be restored, open to the public, visitors walking through rooms where Cudjo lived, seeing the garden where he grew vegetables, standing where he told Zora Neale Hurston his story. The announcement brought mixed reactions in Africatown. Some residents excited about recognition and potential economic benefits. Others skeptical, worried the project would be controlled by outsiders not understanding or respecting community needs and priorities. Concerns about who would tell the story, how told, who would benefit. Community leaders insisted development must be led by and for Africatown residents' benefit. They demanded Clotilda survivor descendants be involved in every planning and implementation aspect. They called for investments in infrastructure, environmental cleanup, education, economic development, not just heritage tourism. They argued honoring past meant addressing present, preserving history meant creating a better future for people carrying that history in blood and bones. These demands raised fundamental questions about historical justice in practice. Is it enough to acknowledge past wrongs, build museums and monuments, tell previously hidden stories? Or does justice require material change, reparations, land return, investment in systematically harmed communities? And who decides what justice looks like, historians and government officials, or descendants of the harmed? As of today, these questions remain unresolved. The Clotilda wreck site is a National Historic Landmark, protected and preserved for future study. Cudjo Lewis's house has been restored, open for tours. Barracoon continues widely read, introducing new generations to Cudjo's story. Africatown has received some investment and attention, though residents say it's not nearly enough to address decades of neglect and environmental damage. The Mir family largely remains silent, though pressure for accountability grows. In 2020, calls to rename streets and buildings bearing the Mir name, removing names from public spaces as refusal to honor people committing serious crime. Some efforts succeeded, others stalled from political opposition. But perhaps the Clotilda story's most important legacy isn't about museums, monuments, or even reparations. It's about testimony power, memory importance, and justice's long arc. Cudjo Lewis waited 50 years after abolition to tell his story fully, not because afraid of remembering, but waiting for a world ready to listen. He died in 1935 believing his story might never be heard, truth might die with him. But he did something ensuring his voice would survive. He trusted Zora Neale Hurston with his testimony, and she wrote it down. That manuscript sat in a drawer 80 years, but survived. And when the moment was right, when culture was ready, it spoke with Cudjo's voice, telling a story that refused to die. Today, Africatown visitors can stand before Cudjo Lewis's house and see Zora Neale Hurston's 1927 photograph. Cudjo stands before his house wearing work clothes, holding a walking stick. His face is weathered and tired, but eyes clear and direct, looking straight at the camera, looking at us, looking through time across generations, demanding to be seen and heard. Cudjo Lewis's story isn't about distant past. It's about memory, testimony power, justice's long arc and how it bends only when people refuse to let truth be buried. It's about how crimes committed generations ago create consequences rippling through time, affecting people unborn when crime occurred but inheriting effects nonetheless. It's also about resilience, how people can survive unimaginable trauma and still build lives of meaning and dignity. Cudjo Lewis survived the Middle Passage, slavery, 50 years of dangerous freedom, and survived long enough to ensure his story would outlive people wanting it silenced. He didn't get deserved justice in his lifetime. The Mirs were never prosecuted, punished, or forced to acknowledge crime. But he got something perhaps more powerful. He made sure truth survived. And truth once spoken can never be completely erased again. It can be ignored, dismissed, minimized. But it doesn't disappear. It waits, patient and persistent, for the moment people are ready to listen. And when that moment comes, it speaks with voices of those who refused to be silenced, who insisted their lives mattered, who demanded their stories be told. Cudjo Lewis's voice speaks today across 160 years, telling about a crime supposed to be forgotten, a ship supposed to stay buried, a truth supposed to die. But it didn't die. It survived, carried forward by memory, testimony, people's refusal to let injustice be erased from history. The question we face now is the same Cudjo faced: what do we do with truth once told? Do we acknowledge it and move on, treating it as interesting history? Or recognize the Clotilda crime and the system allowing it to happen and be covered up, created consequences still unfolding today? Do we see connection between what happened to Cudjo and what continues to happen to his descendants and Black communities across America? These aren't easy questions, they have no simple answers. But they are questions we must ask if we want to honor Cudjo's testimony, do justice to his memory, create a world where such crimes are not just acknowledged but addressed, where truth is not just told but acted upon. Cudjo Lewis died in 1935, but his story lives on. It lives in words he spoke to Zora Neale Hurston, preserved in Barracoon. It lives in the Clotilda wreck, now a National Historic Landmark. It lives in Africatown, the community he and other survivors built against all odds. And it lives in the ongoing struggle for justice, recognition, reparations, for a world where truth matters and crimes aren't forgotten just because they're old. In the end, Cudjo won. Not the justice he deserved, not the peace he sought, not the return to Africa he longed for. But he won the battle that mattered most to him. He made sure truth survived. And as long as truth survives, as long as people remember and tell his story, as long as we refuse to let past be buried and forgotten, there is hope for justice, however long it takes to arrive.